Hello ladies and gentlemen, Willie here. Today's video is looking ahead. With the gauging of interest from Blizzard in the community's desire for TBC, now is the time to bring these subjects up, because I have a very strong feeling Blizzard has received a majority of extremely interested votes for TBC following Classic's conclusion. And this has been a hard video to get down and get right, because what I want at the end of the day is a game that's fun and compelling, whilst remaining true to the aspects that made TBC such a success. Let me ask you this, what makes a legacy server great? Is it the community, the overall population, the server stability, accurate scripting of encounters for questing and PvE, the PvP content, a fresh experience, realism when compared to its source material, efforts to rebalance for a new journey this time around? Maybe all of the above. We're very fortunate in that many of the issues facing your average private server have already been answered with Blizzard, such as stability, population and longevity. We are also fortunate because we have the benefit of hindsight. We can look back and see flaws, what worked and what didn't, and how the game has evolved over time. Except this time around we have hindsight of both of how the game was back then in TBC and of how rolling out and pacing of the game has worked out for Classic. So with this in mind, are we going to choose to make the same mistakes again? The areas I want to focus on today are twofold. Number one being in which manner Blizzard could roll out the content in terms of pacing, patch and selective content releases, and two, the overall balance issues associated with TBC. Let's start with the possible approaches to the TBC launch and have a look into content pacing. Now if we go as we have with Classic by setting the benchmark on the final patch, we will launch on patch 2.4.3. This was the patch with the Sunwell and all the content surrounding that had been released, and I think there are 100% lessons learned from launching on a final patch rather than having some degree of progression. Many core aspects of TBC have been nerfed by 2.43 in ways to allow catch up to be a bit easier. First of all, let me tell you about attunement changes. In one way, attunements are a cool thing to have to do. They keep you busy, but by the end of the expansion, the thought of running new players through old content that you vastly outgear again and again was getting kind of tiresome. That's why they were nerfed later on, but early on this really shouldn't be a thing. Players should have to look at getting attuned if they want access to the top tier content as both a challenge and a reward. In patch 2.1.2, the need for attunement to Tempest Keep and Serpent Shrine Cavern were removed. Blizzard's reasoning was, after a lot of thought and deliberation, we've decided to remove the attunement requirements to enter SSC and Tempest Keep the Eye. Whilst many of our attunements in the Burning Crusade have been good progression checks, a few of the attunements have turned out to cause unnecessary stress on guilds, either doing content or attempting to do the content. With Black Temple and Mount Hyjal thriving, we want to encourage, rather than prevent, new guilds forming to attempt Serpent Shrine and TK. We're going to leave the current attunement quests in the game so that players can engage in the challenge and the lore aspect of these quests should they choose to. And at a later point we're considering adding a final reward step to these quests as well, for those that have already completed them to get some kind of further reward. In 2.3 the requirement for heroic dungeon keys from reputations was lowered from revered to honoured, and these keys were the foundation of the attunement system and spanned 4 reputations. Those being the Cenarian Expedition for Steam Vault, Shataf the Arcatraz key, Lower City for Shadow Labs, and your faction specific Hellfire Peninsula reputation for Shattered Halls, and all of these were needed to eventually get the Tempest Keep key, which was then needed for Mount Hyjal, and so on. These new rewards I was just talking about ended up being some very prestigious limited titles which were bound to the attunements, those being Champion of the Naru for completing Tempest Keep and Coalfang Reservoir, which were introduced in 2.3, and then later on in 2.4 Hand of Adal for doing the attunements for Mount Hyjal and Black Temple. Patch 2.4 was the patch where attunements were just completely nuked. You no longer needed the key to enter Karazhan, you didn't have to complete the Vials of Eternity to enter Mount Hyjal, which involved defeating Kel'Thas and Lady Vash, and you didn't need to complete the attunement for Black Temple either. At this point all the content was free to enter at any point, apart from the heroic dungeons still needing keys, but they only required honours, so it wasn't much a barrier to entry. And I agree with relaxing attunements later on down the line, but let's make sure it's kept in line with how it was in TBC and not there from launch. The next learning point from Classic is releasing content on a patch where players have been buffed considerably and the content has been nerfed considerably. If we release on 2.43, the first few raids are going to be incredibly easy, just like how Molten Core was. Now to be honest, a lot of the content on release was very difficult and tuned to be a challenge for those guilds who had been working on Naxxramas, since Naxxramas was kind of cut short by TBC's release. Especially the likes of Gruul and McTheridan's Lair were both no joke, whereas they were progressively nerfed more and more as patches went on. On top of this, the heroic dungeons were severely changed as a whole and nerfed early on in TBC. Here are the 2.1 patch notes, for example. This was when Black Temple was released. Pretty much everything you're seeing here is a nerf. Karazhan was nerfed in both bosses and trash, McTheridan was nerfed, more or less every single dungeon was nerfed, the health of many bosses in Serpent Shrine Cavern was nerfed. Looking at the next major patch, 2.2, more dungeons nerfed, Tempest Keep nerfed, more Serpent Shrine Cavern nerfs, 2.3, more dungeons nerfed, Tempest Keep nerfed more. You get the idea. Now, I'm not saying that things should be difficult or frankly just overtuned for the sake of it, but we've seen what happens if you give players endgame itemization and talents on top of retuned content, and it just ends up being face roll material. Talking about class changes, of course many were just bug fixes or quality of life changes. Blizzard's vision of how a spell should work didn't always line up with what happened initially. Some changes were just improvements. In 2.1, Mutilate got its attack animation, the charge effect for warriors now ignored slowing effects, Sap no longer remove you from stealth. In 2.2, Night Elf Cat melee range was buffed to match Tauren. Polymorph and Sap were reduced to 10-second duration in PvP. Paladin's blessings were increased to 10 and 30 minutes respectively. Hammer of Wrath's cast time was reduced to 0.5 seconds. Ritual of Refreshment was brought in 2.3. And Ret Pallies had a huge rework in 2.3, and honestly I don't even mind them being buffed up considerably. I think they've waited long enough by this point, and it hardly breaks the game. A lot of these are just pretty nice changes. Some of them make your class better, others make them a bit worse, but I'd be happy to see all of them in the game from day one. But then we have the pure buffs that were done over time. Looking at 2.4, Holy Shock was buffed in damage and healing. Rogues got new talents to increase crits with certain abilities. Shamanistic Rage got a 30% damage reduction added onto it. It's just concerning that we may be going into another game with nerfed content and buffed players. We've seen how it plays out, and I think it's going to take a lot away from the game. What do I propose then? Well, ideally, and this would be a big ideally, all class and bug fixes and quality of life changes from 2.43. But nothing that changes numbers performance-wise. Obviously this is a large amount of work, but I think that work will give us the best results. Also, there will actually be changes a bit from patch to patch for your class. This makes it a bit more exciting rather than knowing what is meta and what will be meta from day one and it never really changing, like in Classic. These days there are metas, people have played private servers, and players are just so much better. This is one reason why giving us nerf content and stronger classes is also a mistake. TBC launched with a huge amount of raid content. Karazhan, Serpent Shrine Cavern, Tempest Keep Gruul's Lair and McTheridan's Lair were all on release. Hydra was also there from my research, however it required an attunement from defeating Vash and Kael'thas, so this was a big barrier to entry to get inside and everybody had to be attuned, so functionally it sort of wasn't available for quite a while. That's a very large amount of content in TBC, by the way, all of that. Attunements were the real gate between one thing and the next. If it's nerfed, people will blast through it and complain there's nothing to do, just like in Classic. And of course that's people's nature and own fault, but it doesn't have to be that way. Let there be progressive patches, make heroic keys revered, make attunements required until at least the patch that they were removed in TBC. Gauge the player base on things. Putting a higher barrier to entry is better than lower, because once you're over that barrier it's done. Lowering difficulty over time is better than starting too easy. And if people are able to get in Hydra within a few weeks, we'd potentially have 3 tier sets in the game from near the start. Tier 4 from Gruul, Mag and Kara, Tier 5 from TK and SSC, and the head and gloves of Tier 6 from Hydra. That's just too much gear. Okay, so that's sort of part 1 of my concerns in terms of the pacing and content. Next, layering. Outland is smaller than Kalimdor and the Eastern Kingdoms. It's 7 zones, the latter is around 40. PvP servers are going to be a complete fiesta for a very long time, potentially the whole expansion. If the game releases with open transfers, your server balance will take a hit, which will probably colour it fully blue or red. Honestly, this seems kind of unavoidable, and it's going to affect the economy big time as well. It's 100% going to come back. I don't think there's anything we can do about it, other than hope it's not there for the entire expansion. Let me know if you have anything else to add here. Next, melee leeway and spell batching. Please, just please, bin them, both of them. Look, I'm not even the biggest PvP fan here, I'll admit it, but the thought of arena with batching sounds absolutely awful. It takes away your ability to react and counterplay, it makes heals not land, it creates bad interactions. I've done a whole video on the subject and I sincerely hope for you PvPers that it is removed when we come to TBC. Okay, so that's part 2, and I think up to here what I've said is largely agreeable, nothing too controversial. There are more changes in the functionality of how players interact with the game, and the lessons I believe we've learned from the launch of Classic. Now we move on to changes more specifically concerning TBC. I feel like no one's talking about this, but racials. Horde racials specifically. I like racials, they're one of the many things that make our classes unique, and not bland, great templates. Now, just to start, in Classic, Horde racials are also great, specifically Will of the Forsaken, Blood Rage, and Berserking. Alliance have some good ones too, like Escape Artist and Perception can be very nice, and notice we're just talking about combat related racials here. However, in Classic, this is kind of balanced out by the fact that Alliance get Paladin and Horde get Shaman. And for me, Blessings and Auras are better than Totems as forms of buffs. In fact, they might just be better than Heroism too in TBC. Why? One Paladin can buff an entire raid, Blessings don't require constant upkeep, don't have a minimum range, and are just better in terms of stats granted. Auras don't require upkeep, have a larger base range, and you don't have to choose between resistance auras or damage auras like Shaman do with Totems. So when you give the faction that already has stronger racials Paladins, the scales really begin to tip. In fact, that's a bit of an understatement, the scales practically fall over. TBC was really the start of Horde domination in pretty much all aspects of the game. Blood Fury was given a spell damage equivalent, so it wasn't a dead button for casters. Berserking was still good, and it was the same as it is in Classic. Will of the Forsaken was still the exact same in Classic as well, and then Blood Elves got Arcane Torrent. Arcane Torrent. This racial actually reads like an ability someone made up, as if they tried to make the most overpowered thing possible that could still get into the game. It's an instant cast off GCD, 2-second AoE silence that generates your primary resource on a 2-minute cooldown. Just for comparison, Draenei got Gift of the Naru, which healed for about 1000 at 70 baseline. Oh, and it has a 1.5 second cast time and a 3-minute cooldown. Right then. Oh, also Escape Artist got nerfed in 2.3 from a 45 second cooldown to 1 minute. Now, back to the Horde side, the Blood Fury buffs are actually fair enough to be honest. I don't mind it actually being useful for Orc casters, as no other race literally has a dead button like this. Hardiness was nerfed from 25% extra resist to 15 as well, and Berserking for Trolls wasn't made 20% baseline until Wrath of the Lich King, but Undead and Blood Elf though. I'm gonna say it, Will of the Forsaken and Arcane Torrent are too powerful and should be nerfed. And there is reasoning behind this alongside the abilities being very strong. In 2.1.2, PvP trinkets were redesigned, from removing certain effects to removing any loss of control effects the way they are today. And Will of the Forsaken does not share a cooldown there. It didn't share a cooldown until patch 3.3 in Wrath of the Lich King, where Will of the Forsaken now shares a 45 second cooldown with any similar effects, including the PvP trinket. This is the nerf I would like for TBC, seeing as Undead will also be able to remove any CC effects. As for Arcane Torrent, I just think it's straight up overtuned. Silences didn't have a diminishing returns until Wrath of the Lich King. The ability is too oppressive and should in some manner be tuned down. In retail now it removes one beneficial magic effect from all nearby enemies, but I think that might be a bit over the top. I would prefer it if it were just an interrupt. At least casters aren't completely disabled as they are when they are silenced. The long process of the Horde power level becoming more and more apparent made Blizzard eventually give human the every man for himself racial in Wrath of the Lich King, which was a PvP trinket for free to try and encourage people to play Alliance, and this was crazy powerful and let humans pick a second offensive trinket. This was the extent of what Blizzard had to try and do to turn back the power on racials to the other side. In fact, arenas as a whole would probably be better without racials in the mix, but that's just not going to happen, is it? And speaking of hindsight, as we did at the start of this video, recently a TBC private server has released Endless TBC, and they made considerable efforts to address faction balance. The amount of stuff they gave to the Alliance for free was huge. Shared quest items, extra XP, extra honour, free riding, bonus reputation, and shared seals. In fact, this ended up overdoing it as the Alliance were edging closer to the high 50s in population percentage, but then some of these buffs were offered to the Horde and the balance is coming back around by the looks of it. Live and active balancing like this is extremely interesting into just how many incentives people will need to pick Alliance over Horde. A lot of these changes to balance that they have made would not be things that would happen on a Blizzard server. Well, apart from one of them I hope, which is Seal of Blood and Seal of Vengeance. Now, these are two new spells introduced to TBC for Paladins, Blood for Blood Elf and Vengeance for Alliance. Now, the long and short of it is Blood does way more damage than Vengeance. Way more. On top of Blood Elves having their 2-second AoE silence, the race class combo is better than any version of Paladin that Alliance can have. We have racials of course that make your class different, but class specific abilities are another thing. I would like to see both factions have the same spell here to offset the imbalance. My one issue with this is lore. I know you may think this sounds dumb, but Blood Elf Paladins' deal is that they bend their light to their will, hence Blood Elves and Seal of Blood dealing damage to themselves. It doesn't make any sense for humans or dwarves at all. Some kind of different flavour would be needed for Alliance to have this ability in my opinion. And finally there's the issues surrounding the amount of gold that people will have saved up come the launch of TBC. We need to see what will happen here, whether we're able to copy characters or transfer them, but just as I mentioned in my survey video, I think some kind of limitation will be needed to put in place. We can talk about this one more later once we have some more information from Blizzard's side into what our definitive options will be for crossing over to Burning Crusade content, so we'll have to wait and see there. And those are my impressions so far in what I would like to see with TBC. I think we can learn a lot from how Classic has gone so far. We must benefit from our hindsight and tell Blizzard what we want, or we may just be on a course to make the same mistakes over and over again. And we should, as much as possible, choose to avoid that happening. Let me know your thoughts. As always, I do hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you guys in the next one. If you like what you see, give the video a like and subscribe, as there's plenty more to come. As always, thank you all so much for watching. Take care. Bye.